Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to be looking at customizing the binding context so that we can manipulate item template objects. Let's take a look at our app so far. In the previous video, we just completed the edit action so that when you choose an element in this collection view, you can click on it and then choose to edit it. And what I was thinking instead is this is a bit of a clunky design, so we're going to change it so that each row in our collection view has its own little bit of controls on the sides. Now, in MAUI, you can produce a lot of really nice looking designs. This isn't one of them because these videos really focus on the functionality and the code behind. But what we would be moving towards if we were making an app for production is controlling gestures, various buttons that are hidden that show up, say if you long press or you swipe left. We could implement different controls like that. On the Windows platform, you're going to have issues with swiping because it's not a touch interface. The swipe gesture doesn't really work very well with the mouse. And I want these demos to truly be universal so that they can be used in any environment, which is why we're not really focusing too much on actions like that. But we can simulate something similar with putting a control on each of the items in the collection view. So rather than having to click on an item and then click on the edit button, each item is going to have its own little edit button right next to it. And then in the future, if you wanted to incorporate swipes, you could take those buttons, which are applied on each item, and just put them into a swipe gesture recognizer instead of showing up on the screen all the time. It's just something to think about for future development options. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start by getting rid of this edit button. And I want to modify my item template so that each one of these items is followed by its own little edit button. This will allow us to save a step in the UI interface where rather than clicking an item and then clicking an edit button, we can just click the relevant edit button that is next to the item that we want to edit. So a lot of the logic behind is going to stay the same. It's mostly just the interface and how we interact with this app that's going to be different. But there is a little bit of a difference in how we display the information here inside the data template, because now we're not just going to have binding the text representation of one item, we're also going to include some buttons inside the data template. So let's make our changes here. First of all, this button for editing a selected invoice, we're just going to get that right on out of there. Now it's in grid row 1, so because there's nothing else in that row, I'm also going to modify the other elements, the grid and the rows for the other things to just remove row 1 completely. So we'll get rid of this button. We'll move our collection view from row 2 to row 1, and we can get rid of one of these. So now I'm back to just my regular 3 rows. Now at this point, we're only using row 0 and row 1. I do have another video coming up after this one that's going to put something into row 2 for us. So let's focus on our collection view. Right now, our label is binding to one single instance of invoice item. So within the data template, the binding context changes. Outside of the template, the collection view, the label, the entry, the button, all of these bindings are pointing to invoice collection view model. But inside the data template, the binding context changes to one invoice item. So each invoice item is being represented here as a string. And next to that string, we're just going to add in a button for editing. So I've got a button. It says the word edit on it, and it's 60 pixels wide at this point, just a small little button next to each one. We could run the app and take a look at what that looks like, but we'll see it in the future, so we'll just keep moving. When we click on this edit, we want it to have the same action that our previous edit button did. That is, it's going to populate for us the description, quantity, and price into the labels and the entries. Now the way that that works in the code behind is we would call on this command here called edit selected invoice. And the way that this command works is that it only works when an invoice is selected. So that means our description, quantity, and price have to come from a selected invoice. Now there's one thing that we have to be careful of here, because if we're looking at the collection view and we click on the edit button inside a particular item, that does not count as clicking on the item. So here's our app as it loads up. Each one has an edit button next to it. But if I click on the edit button, I'm not really clicking on the item. It won't change the selected item. It won't know that an item is selected in the collection view because clicking the button is different from clicking the item. So at this point, in order for this to work, I would have to click the item and then click the edit button in order to populate those two things. And we don't want to have to take that extra step. So we're going to move away from looking at the selected item because clicking on that button may not actually select the item for us. So instead, we're going to need some way of telling the edit button which item it is we want to edit. And luckily, because the edit button and the element that we're trying to edit are in the same scope, we can refer to them pretty easily. So let's go back to our XAML page. Our button is going to point to some command for editing, and our command now needs to know which element we're going to edit. So whenever we want to call a command and pass it a little bit of information, we can use that additional piece called command parameter. So if we want our edit button to bring along with it a reference to the element that we're actually trying to edit, we can use our command parameter and bind that to the same object that's showing in the label. Remember, the dot points to a particular invoice item. So if we click this button and send a command parameter, the command parameter is bound to the entire invoice item. So whenever we click this edit button, we'll send a parameter of whichever invoice is next to that button. These point to the same element. So now all we have to do is set the command. And setting the command is something that we've done a bunch of times. There's already another example right up here. So you think that it would be a little bit simple to bind to the existing value. Let's go back to our view model and just confirm here that this is the command that we want to bind to, edit selected invoice command. But if we put that here in the binding, it might be a clue that it's not showing up in the IntelliSense. So our edit selected invoice command is not available. The only things that are available are properties of invoice item. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because inside our data template, we are no longer using invoice collection view model as our data type. So our binding context now is one invoice item. That works great for our command parameter, but it doesn't help us point to where our command is. So what we'll need to do here is change the binding source just for this one command. The binding source that we want is going to be invoice collection view model. It's the binding source of our page, but it's not the binding source of our current context, the data template. So what we need to do is go to the data template's ancestor. So if we think about how the data tree here works, we have the data template being inside the collection view is inside the grid is inside the page. We have this tree structure where everything is a part of something else. So if we want to get to outer levels, we can refer to its ancestor. So the source for this binding is going to be set to a value that includes a reference to the ancestor. And the ancestor, in this case, has a data type of invoice collection view model. So we're looking at a relative source And we have to tell the relative source which ancestor type we're looking for. And it's going to climb its way back out of the tree until it finds a binding context in an ancestor that matches this data type. So we've got relative source, and then we're going to set ancestor type to a specific type called invoice collection view model. So invoice collection view model is the data type of our page. Inside the data template, our default binding is an invoice item. But if we're going to say, look in your relative sources for an ancestor type that is invoice collection view model, it's going to move out to the collection view, move out to the grid, move out to the page, looking for that view model. We can point it to the view model, and now it's going to look in there for this selected invoice command. Let's take a look at what we have so far. So here's what our app looks like right now. You'll notice that all the edit buttons are grayed out. The reason for that is because the invoice command is not available until you select an invoice. I think these should be available all the time, so we'll go in and change that after. When I click on one of them, you'll see that now an invoice is selected, so the edit buttons all become available. That's why we want them to be available at all times. We shouldn't have to click once before clicking again. So once we click on an edit button, we're going to go and see this populating. However, you'll see that as I click on the other edit buttons, the values are not updating here. The values are pulled from the selected value in the collection view, not dependent on which button you click. So if I select item B and then I click the edit button next to item A, item B is the value that's populating this. So what we need to do is modify our command so that instead of using the selected item, it's going to use the command parameter to figure out which of these values we want to use to populate our edit form. So let's go back behind here and we'll make some changes. So at this point, we have no need for binding or finding out what the selected item in the collection view is. If we're doing this differently, then we don't need to worry about selecting one. I will need a reference to some item so that eventually we know which item is going to be updated. But we're going to modify this so that it doesn't use the selected item. So let's get rid of selected item completely. We don't want to have to select an item before we click its edit button. The edit button is going to come along with the item that we need as its command parameter. So in here, we're not going to disable those buttons when no invoice is selected. In fact, we don't need to worry about which invoice is selected at all. So let's just completely get rid of the selected invoice property. When we want to do a selected invoice command, this command is going to take that command parameter, and the command parameter type is one invoice item. Where are we getting the values to populate these three properties? It's going to be from the item that comes in as the command parameter. So when you click on this edit button, the command parameter is going to bring along an entire invoice item object. The invoice item comes in here, and we're going to use it to populate these three values. Let's make sure that works before we move on. Now you might have noticed as we try to run this, we've got some errors preventing us from compiling. I removed selected invoice, and so now we're not able to submit any changes. The submit changes method, that's what happens when you click on the update button. This is the part where we're going to make a new invoice item and replace the existing selected one. If we don't have a selected one, we don't know which one to replace. So what we're going to do here is when we click on an edit button, we're going to take that item, the item that we've chosen to edit, and just store it here in a private variable. We'll call it invoice item, item to update. We don't need any public property. We don't need any binding to it. We're just storing it in the background so that we know which one to change when the time comes. So we'll call it here, item to update, and save it privately in the background. That will allow us to know which one we're trying to change. We're trying to change that item, and then when we're finished, we will clear it out. So it's the same kind of process that we were doing before with knowing which item to update. The only difference is we don't need a public-facing property to bind to. We can just kind of hide this in the background. So now we should be able to run the app and test it out. So here's our app. All the edit buttons are available. The update is not yet available. When I click on one of the edit buttons, the selected item that I've chosen to edit is passed through as a command parameter. The values get populated into these values here. We can update the quantity. We can update the price. And when we click on update, the value changes in the collection just as it did before. So this is just a slightly different way that we can keep track of and update items in a collection without having to physically select an item in the collection view. So I hope you found this useful. We're going to move on now to just adding one additional piece, and that is the delete. So if we can make an edit button, we can also make a delete command that does the same sort of thing. In fact, I'm going to copy the edit button, and we'll paste another button down below. Actually, let's just put it right in there. So I've copied my edit button. I want to call a different command. We'll call this one delete command. And when we want to delete a particular invoice, we're going to pass as the command parameter a reference to that invoice. So again, I don't have to worry about selecting it from the collection view. I'm getting it right here from our local binding. Our local binding is one item in the collection, an invoice item. The command, however, is not in the invoice item class. It's in the invoice collection view model. So the source, the binding context for that particular command is the relative source that looks for that type in the ancestor. It says go out and back up the tree until you find that binding context. So let's go over to our invoice collection view model and write a delete command. The delete command is going to be a relay command. And just like the edit command, we're getting a command parameter that shows us a reference to the element that we want to delete. It's an invoice item. And delete logic is fairly straightforward. We want to remove that item from the collection of invoices. We want to remove the item. That's really all there is to it. When you click the delete button, the command parameter comes through. That item gets removed from the collection. When I copied the button, I just neglected to change the label on it. So I'm going to go back to our XAML code, and we'll make this button text for the delete button. I can put the word delete, but I'll just make it an X for now. X is a pretty noteworthy symbol for a deletion. Because it's just a change to the XAML, you can see that the hot reload has already updated it. I could do it with the app running. And we'll click on that X and watch items disappear from the collection. So again, I hope you found that little part of the demo useful as well. and we'll see you in the next video.